Hello everyone, is Bringonthechaos Glizzy for another What If. Beerus is an Olympian god of destruction. Beerus has been erased because of the mistake Goku, but he encountered the fathers of all angels. He is in a new world field of gods. What will happen to a former G.O.D?
Chapter 16. The Olympian God of Destruction. Chapter 16. The Titanomic Eye. The next day. Leaving me till last, Beerus. Hera smirked as she appeared in the clearing with a hand propped on her hip, looking as smug as she had when she'd paid him back earlier. To think, I got you so worked up you got the others out of the way early on the same day, just so you could save me on my lonesome for the next. You flatter me, really. Beerus felt his eye twitch in aggravation, but did not rise to the blatantly obvious bait, even when she goaded him further with an infuriatingly suggestive wink. He wanted to kick her ass, sure, but he couldn't make it too obvious how irritable he currently was with her here, as that would only show her that she'd actually succeeded in getting inside his head. And the last thing he needed right now was to give her affirmation that she'd gotten to him, as given how aggressive and confrontational he knew her to be, he knew damn well she'd take that knowledge against him as far as she could. Cut the crap and let's get this started already, Beerus said, holding in his temper as he brought his fists behind his back and pressed them into each other. I know you're delusional and all, but remember, I'm here to test you and see how far you've come, so go ahead and show me what you can do. Rather than be annoyed at him calling her delusional, Hera's smirk just widened as her eyes met his. All right then, have it your way. But as I said to you before, do try not to disappoint me with your training, as I have high standards for what I expect. Beerus, already tired of waiting, and further annoyed that she'd repeated that line of thought again as though he had to prove something to her, didn't bother biding his time for her to make the first move. His body suddenly bursting forward, seemingly disappearing from sight as his palm thrusted forward, aiming directly for Hera's chest. But, to her credit, Hera reacted in time and jumped back to avoid the palm strike, creating a 10-meter distance between them as his blow struck nothing but air. Hera was still smirking at him even then, before she then retaliated in kind, rushing forward the same way he had, but throwing up a side kick aimed for his face instead when she closed the gap. It blurred up at him with speed greater than his own attack, but all the same, her ankle was caught just before the sole of her foot even grazed his nose, with his hand wrapped like a vice around it and halting her momentum. The fledgling goddess wasn't surprised in the slightest by this. Instead, she immediately teleported out of his grasp, appearing above him with his back to her and one curvy leg of hers raised up high for an axe kick down on his skull. When her leg swung down with an impressive amount of force, Beerus didn't even bother to look up as the same hand that had caught her before did the same again, wrapping around her ankle as her leg was mid-swing. In the same motion, he wrenched his arm down and leaned his body forward as he swung his airborne sister downward ankle first for a vicious slam to the ground, her entire form blurring from the dizzying speed in which he did it. No impact was made though, as Hera shape-shifted herself into a small bird just in time, flapping her wings and gliding up through the air out of his grip again as she avoided getting smashed into the earth. Rather than retreat back though, Hera twirled in the air several meters above her brother and shot down beak first toward him like a miniature comet, transforming herself back to her original form when she was scant inches away. Her dainty hands grabbing onto either side of his head before driving her knee forward like a bludgeoning hammer, intent on caving his face in with a considerable jump in speed. She was met with Beerus ducking down out of her hand's grip, seemingly with ease, as her kick swung by and missed its mark, with her toes barely grazing over his long, purple hair before he shimmered out of existence. His form reappearing by her side in midair as he thrust a powerful side kick of his own toward her hip, which she just about managed to react to in time, torquing her body somewhat in midair and bringing up a knee to block. The strength of the blow still sent her hurtling back with a small shockwave, feeling the bones around her kneecap rattle somewhat as her other foot dug into the ground to slow herself, creating a tiny, but long trench that was quickly joined by another as her other foot ground down. Her body eventually coming to a stop about close to 100 feet away. Hera wasn't given any time to breathe though, as Beerus phased into existence right in front of her with a hunched posture and a fist reared back, ready to smash her face into paste. At the last possible second, she was able to dematerialize as his fist whizzed in with pulverizing force, body glowing with a thin, dark purple aura. She then reappeared as a snake with her fiery red aura thinly encompassing her and lunging into him. Seemingly getting through his guard, she wrapped her long, serpentine body around both his neck, and the wrist of his outstretched arm, heaving with as much might as she could muster in that small interval to force his fist back right towards his face. She almost succeeded in doing so, only for the knuckles of his fist to halt just an inch from his face, and refuse to budge any further from there. "You've got some nerve to try and hit me with my own punch, I'll give you that," Beerus remarked, totally ignoring her attempt to choke him by coiling the upper part of her serpent body harder around his neck, only feeling a bit of discomfort from the effort. "But you're also gullible if you actually think you just slipped through my guard." As he said this, Beerus' other hand flew up at speeds Hera couldn't react to, his pointer finger jabbing several points over her reptile body, including dead center on her head. His swift pressure point attacks not only slackening her grip on his wrist and neck completely, but also whiting Hera's eyes out as he knocked her unconscious for a very brief period. He swiftly followed this up before she snapped back awake by moving his hand that had previously been caught on the wrist over the bottom end of her snake form, close enough to the tail whilst easily slipping his head out from the coiled form of Hera. His hand gripped her close to the tail then, and tugged her up as he started swinging her around and around above his head so fast that her blurring form seemed to take the shape of a mini tornado, before launching her forward like a javelin. By the time Hera had snapped awake, her serpent body had been sent careening at high speeds, plowing through and uprooting trees before crashing into the ground, forming a deeper trench as she went, before her snake form finally impacted with a large, hard rock. Her momentum coming to a halt as she broke through it, and had the debris from it crumbling on top of her about half a mile away from him. HMPH. Beerus would be lying if he said there wasn't a good chunk of him taking satisfaction from that, though he managed to keep a smirk off his face. So far, anyway. And you were telling me that you had high standards. Your performance so far is quite lack. Beerus suddenly ducked on instinct, as a thick, curvy leg shimmered into existence just where his face had been with a kick that had enough power behind it to send a focused shockwave that left a huge indent in the mountain's hide behind him, along with making the full structure quiver. "I thought you said to cut the crap." Hera snapped back, showing some aggression in her tone as her leg suddenly teleported from its position above his head, leaving Beerus confused in that small instant, as the rest of her remained, only to be genuinely caught off guard as her leg reappeared beneath him. The front of her foot almost cracking against his chin as she swung it up with brutal, yet efficient force, not unlike how a swordsman would have thrust their blade up for an upward slash, as his forearms crossed in the nick of time to block it. "We've only just started, Beerus. No need to get ahead of yourself. No need to get ahead of myself." Even though Beerus held the desire to whoop her ass in this session after the stunt she pulled, he couldn't deny the sheer balls she had metaphorically to throw that line at him. Not only that, but teleporting a singular body part in the middle of a fight to catch him by surprise, seeing as no one who'd sparred with him prior, not even Zeus, had done that yet. She may be a bitch, but she definitely had some fighting spirit and talent to her, as begrudging as that was to admit. You dare to tell me that? Damn right I do. She exclaimed strongly, not wavering for an instant, as she launched into a barrage of attacks as soon as he pushed her foot away, bombarding him with a series of punches, elbows and kicks to just about every area she could aim for, from his ankles all the way up to his head. She did not let up for even an insignificant moment as she forced him to defend in kind, blocking with his forearms, hands and legs and feet himself as she managed to push him back. Her expression fierce, despite the smile still on her face. I've barely even warmed up, so you'd better get ready, Beerus. Her leg suddenly dematerialized again mid-swing as he brought his knee up to block, only to reappear right away between his legs. His eyes widened upon noticing this as her shin shot up at high velocity, with only his battle instincts given how much he was holding back saving him, as his palm thrust down and stopped her leg's momentum cold, barely a centimeter off of crashing into his crown jewels. The force behind what he'd stopped actually making his palm shake a little, making it clear that if he'd let that hit him, his balls either would have been squashed, or sent flying right out of his gullet. Or else I may end up finishing this spar sooner than expected. Beerus's eye twitched agitatedly again from the sheer audacity of that last statement. Why you cocky little, Hera shapeshifted into a small bird just as he struck out with a punch, gliding over the skin of his knuckles before rolling her avian body around, and transforming herself back right as her feet were angled towards. He was quickly forced to bring up his other arm to block the double-footed stomp she attempted on his face as her aura flared, flattening the ground beneath him in a 10-foot wide and deep crater, before he pushed back with said arm, forcing her to spring back off it in kind and land back on her feet well beyond the crater with a graceful backflip. As if you could actually make me submit. The crater widened and deepened several feet more as he propelled himself off of it, getting right in Hera's grill in an instant and re-engaging her. This time, with him being the one to throw numerous combinations of quick, efficient attacks in a superb barrage that had every part of his body creating afterimages in his wake. The fledgling goddess throwing in much more effort than he had into dodging and occasionally parrying his attacks, as his aura flared up slightly. His body blitzing around hers with a veritable typhoon of punches and kicks with her at the center. Every dodge having the skin of his limbs grazing off her tunic or body, while those she had to parry still made her bones rattle inside her from the increasingly high amount of force present in them. Eventually, Hera found a reprieve long enough during the storm to focus and teleport herself out of the danger zone, timing her brother quite well as she got behind him right when he would have gotten behind her, and thrust her foot toward the back of his left leg. His body shimmered out of sight though just as her foot would have collided, passing harmlessly through air, before her other foot was swept out from under her before she could react, sending her falling onto her side where her sizable, ample breasts jiggled inside of her tunic. She bounced back quick though, springing up and striking from her downed position with a front kick behind her, which Beerus caught with one hand before wrenching upside down off the earth, and then letting go of her foot as he shot a fist toward her abdomen. She didn't see even a hint of surprise on his face when she transformed into a snake again to have the punch pass harmlessly through her wriggly form, before coiling over the appendage and slithering up past his shoulder at high speed to bare her fangs with a hiss. Beerus was quick to clamp her mouth shut with his other hand before she could bite him in the neck, but she transformed herself as soon as he did that, having known that wouldn't work, into a fly and buzzing through the finger gaps of it, landing right on his nose. The purple-haired deity was immediate in his action to try and swat her off with the hand closer to his face, but never got the chance, as Hera's form shifted the instant she landed on the ridge, and before long, ending up back in her humanoid form with her legs wrapping around Beerus's head, and her tunic's length shortened considerably. The latter's eyes bulging as the gutsy bitch had the stones to push his face within her tunic and dangerously close to a crotch that had nothing worn over it beneath. The extremely minute time frame in which his frame stilled was enough for Hera to violently torque her body back, Aura spiking higher than ever as she pulled his head with her, tugging his feet off the ground as she flipped them both over, barbarously piledriving the top of his dome into the ground. The biggest and deepest crater yet forming from the impact, easily twice as wide and deep as the last one, with Beerus's whole head firmly plowed inside of it at the center. Hag. As if to get another good lick in while she could, Hera shot to her feet while turning to face him, swinging her leg up whilst her tunic resized itself back down to her feet at will, before dropping her appendage down mercilessly in a powerful axe kick, smashing the heel of her foot right onto his groin. The impact forming quite shockwave that billowed out around them, and making the crater almost twice as big beneath them again with a loud crunch sound that resonated through the area, as she struck him successfully in the balls, this time with much more power than she'd intended previous. Her ears failed to pick up a gasp of pain or anything from her brother, but she could tell from the way his entire body writhed for an instant after she'd hit him there, that he'd definitely felt every bit of it. Hera was quick to flash a smug smile again, as she kept her foot over his groin. Aggression clearer than ever in her pleased tone. I did warn you. It seems that I'll be the one disappointed, since you're not living up to my standards. Putting her hands on her hips and turning her regal nose up at him, she continued. First round goes to me there, I'd say. You can stop this and quit now if you want. I won't hold it over you, much. She finished with a snort, making it clear he'd never hear the end of it if he did. What she got in response less than a moment later, was the ground rumbling beneath her feet, as though a small earthquake was beginning to take place. Hera knew better, however, especially when those rumblings evolved into tremors that savagely shook the very foundations of the earth beneath her feet, and likely around the entire isle. The goddess hopped back immediately, as the ground exploded out from beneath Beerus, his dark purple aura spiking high around his form as a deep, guttural growl surfaced from his throat as he flashed to his feet. His long hair rising up and fluttering in the air with his anger, as his eyes glowed a deep purple to match his aura, teeth ground down against each other as he bit back a snarl while turning his gaze to her, fists clenched hard enough to whiten the knuckles. That tears it. He hissed, the proverbial, kiddie gloves, coming off as the damage done to his genitals healed over, leaving a dull ache where his nuts had been squashed by his overly confident and very vexing sister. No more playing around. I've had enough. Playing around, before Hera could make a sassy remark, Beerus, body suddenly whirred right beside her, directly inside her guard, and grabbed onto her beneath her chin, pressing down painfully into her jaw and cheeks in a vice grip that halted her speech. The action keeping her lips puckered and partially opened as the strain increased, with the sudden jump in speed being enough to keep her briefly stunned in place as he glared her dead in the eye. You want to get rough, do you? The dark purple glow shimmered menacingly around his form, as the air around him crackled. It was impossible not to see how pissed he was, at this point. Well, that's fine by me. Hera teleported out of his grip when it looked like he was about to punch her, appearing behind him to try and attack his back, only for her to get turned on too fast to react. her eyes unable to keep up with him as his body spun around and backhanded her with a clenched fist right in the face. The blow cracking her skull, snapping her head to the side and sending some teeth flying out as an intense shockwave burst forth, one that would have sent her flying had he not grabbed onto her wrist and pulled her in while she was dazed from his first blow. Ichor already dripping from the corner of her mouth where she'd temporarily lost some molars as he smashed his fist into her gut with a crunch of his own, breaking all of her ribs in one go as his fist buried deep into her abdomen, keeling her body over his arm as her feet came off the ground. Goo! Golden blood splattered in droplets out of her open maw, pain ripping through Hera as Beerus followed up by turning his back to face her before grabbing her arm, tossing her over his shoulder, and then delivering a spinning jump kick directly into her shattered rib cage. More blood flew from her gob as she was sent flying back this time, her body upside down as she hurtled through the air with a heavy grimace, part of her intestines battered near to paste from the kick, before her back crashed hard into the hide of Mount Lycaos. The previous craters and such having been removed, either by Gaia, or by the primordial spirit that embodied it, as she formed a huge one around her before her body slunk off the misshapen surface and down to the ground in a heap. Get up, Hera. You wanted it rough, so you're getting it rough. Beerus shouted out as he began to stalk forward, eyes glowing with destruction. A part of him realizing still though that this was meant to train her, so he held back from bull rushing immediately and just pummeling her into dust. Much as a part of him wanted to, outside of giving some temporary catharsis, it wouldn't be productive in the least. Better prepare yourself, because I'm about to give you an educational ass kicking that you desperately need. And one that you won't soon forget. Ugh, Hera groaned in dulling agony, as her injuries rapidly healed over. Her body fully fixed up by the time she rolled up onto her ass with her back pressing into the mountain's rocky surface. Her hazel eyes meeting his glowing ones, as he came forward. Her eyebrows knitting closer together as she glared back at him. And then her form phased out of existence with golden flecks, before she appeared right in front of him as a furious lioness mid-pounce, fangs bared and claws out. This got her jabbed in the forehead by his finger, hitting a pressure point that briefly put her in the realm of the unconscious, before the other hand whirred forth and grabbed onto her neck. His hand getting a tight, almost bone-crushing grip around it before slamming the now feline Hera into the ground, cratering her in a dome-shaped hole multiple meters wide and deep. Too predictable. Try to be more spontaneous and less telegraphed in your approach. This and your previous attacks aren't gonna cut it anymore. Beerus yelled out, before swinging his foot into her ribcage, punting the lioness Hera out of the crater and dozens of meters into the air away from him. His ears picking up the distinct sound of her ribs breaking again as she soared away, only for her form to vanish less than a second later, as Beerus remained on guard despite his seemingly slackening posture. When she emerged again, she dove to him from above as an eagle, and barely flashed away in time to avoid his bicycle kick he used to counter, reappearing close to his side as a fly buzzing toward his face, only to be caught in between two fingers even before his swung-out leg had come back down. Beerus used his thumb to flick her away before she could think to do anything, now that his power and speed had been upped. Trying the same trick twice. Not very smart, considering it involves you being faster reacting than me, which won't happen again. Beerus tilted his head back less than a picosecond later, as Hera flashed back right in front of him, shooting her foot up for his chin with another sidekick, letting the blow sail by his eyes without accomplishing anything. Well, for her anyway, as with speed several times faster than Hera had been, Beerus swept her other leg out from under her, before then reaching out and grabbing onto the back of her head, before slamming her down face first onto his shooting knee. The kneecap bellyboring into her divine features with punishing power, shattering her nose and flattening it into her concaving face, with her hazel eyes bulging outwards in agony around his muscular, tree-trunk-thick leg. Her skull fracturing in numerous places as her brain bounced about raucously inside, ichor flying out in droplets from her mashed face and staining his leg with splotches of golden blood, which then spewed out from her crushed nasal passages once her face was pulled from his sturdy knee. She was somehow still conscious, but unimaginably dazed and out of sorts as her perfect teeth had been chipped and broken, falling down on his leg and the ground from her open maw. Beerus could only scoff, as he delivered another crushing blow, this time in the form of an uppercut, into her jaw, shattering that as well along with breaking her teeth further, as he sent her body flying high into the air above him. Her body flipping around and round uncontrollably as she eventually plummeted to the ground, her body in a heap as she created a small hole around herself from the steep fall, laid out a good 30 meters from the standing form of her brother. Now what did I just say? If you want any chance of landing another blow on me, you'll have to step your game up and think more outside the box. Otherwise, it'll just end the same as did there, understand me? Beerus bellowed out, with the purple glow of his eyes becoming fiercer, as she began to stir and groggily get up. Her broken, horrendously smashed up face mending itself back to its normal, incomprehensible beauty within no time at all, with a searing glare being pointed at him. Following that, Hera would come at him again and again, trying to be the aggressor. Unlike her initial success when he'd been holding back more, however, she held no such luck landing anything on him again. Every time they engaged, Beerus was in total control, never allowing it to slip out of his grasp for even an instant, as he slammed, battered, and pummeled her for every mistake she made, just like the others, if a bit more brutally. He quickly lost count of the amount of times he broke her bones, knocked her unconscious with his pressure point techniques, and countered even her best improvised plans of attack. Even when she started pulling out possibly the best teleport shapeshift combinations he'd dealt with so far, bar Zeus, she couldn't get him. He even shapeshifted himself on occasion and outdid her in that, as well, showing every last hole in her game, both big and small, that he could see. Despite the beating he gave her, and how cathartic it was to a degree, he never forgot to throw in tips and advice when he could so she could improve, and to keep this a productive session that didn't just devolve into him beating her down and nothing else. Their full spar, he could just tell, went on a good deal longer than the others had. Partially because he was getting some enjoyment out of putting her in her place, and partially because Hera was relentless, never stopping or admitting defeat no matter how badly he outclassed her. She just kept meeting him with that same ferocity he'd known her to have, which was one of her good traits when not paired with her bitchiness. Unlike Poseidon, she never showed a hint of fear throughout, though Beerus chalked that up to her being aware deep down that no matter how brutal it was, this was just a spar for her to improve at the end of the day, no matter her sass towards him. Plus, she was showing immediate improvements as they went on, and he could see in real time that initial errors in the way she fought were being closed up, and the more extreme ones were at the very least being alleviated to a certain degree. After about several hours, the area they'd been sparring in had been totally torn apart as if a calamity had taken place there. Craters littered the ground everywhere of varying sizes, with craters inside of several as well. The nearby forest had been torn to shreds, with trees uplifted, splintered and shattered apart, with numerous, massive trenches dug out from where Hera's body had dug into her as she was sent blasting away. The hide of Mount Lycaos looked utterly pulverized after the plethora of times Hera had been smashed into it one way or another in various forms outside of her humanoid one, which was only added to as Hera's back crashed into its heavily misshapen surface one last time. Before she could even perceive of the notion of moving forward as her latest wounds healed over, Beerus's forearm smacked hard into her neck, bashing her head further into the rocky surface and splintering it in a wide radius around her skull. Keeping the forearm pressed into her throat, Beerus held her in place as she coughed and hacked from the blow that almost crushed her windpipe, both dried and fresh ichor dripping down the corners of her lips, as well as down her temple. Her tunic ripped and torn up in multiple places around her torso, showing blemishless, pearly white skin that had been banged up something fierce when those parts had initially been torn up. So, was that up to your high standards, Hera? Beerus asked mockingly, keeping her firmly pressed into the battered bottom section of the mountain. One that no doubt would have been toppled over into rubble a long time ago were it not for Gear's power, as well as perhaps the spirit that embodied it to a lesser extent. HGNN. I suppose it was adequate, Hera sassily threw back with a slight crack to her voice, meeting his gaze unflinchingly, with their faces mere inches away from another. Felt less like training, and more just you blowing off some steam, even with all that advice you were barking out at me. Oh, I assure you, this whole spar was for your benefit only. I just got a little carried away, is all. Beerus replied, totally lying shamelessly through his teeth, and he could tell she knew he was. There was no damn way he was about to admit to what she was thinking as the truth though, and give her some sense of satisfaction over him. Not in a million years. In any case, this spar is just about over. Is that right? Hera managed a quirk up of her lips. Despite the beating she'd taken, her spirit hadn't even been cracked. I can still fight, you know. Oh, I don't doubt that you can. He acknowledged, as the glow over his eyes dissipated completely. Thing is though, it doesn't make a difference. I've seen all I needed to see from you. You've shown me your full power as it is now, and it couldn't get you anywhere against me when I started throwing in a little more effort. I was barely at 5%, perhaps even less while I was thrashing you there. Us continuing further would only prolong me kicking your ass all over the place. But if you want to continue, well, Beerus chuckled, before leaning his head forward until their foreheads touched, bearing his gaze down into hers with a dangerous tint to them. Their closeness now bringing out a certain thrill within his body as he felt her breath wash over him, but he ignored it completely. I guess I could spare a few more minutes to educate you further. Hee. Oh, I bet you'd just love that, wouldn't you, Beerus? She chuckled to herself a little hoarsely, noticing quite well just how close they were, as his hot breath washed over her. A part of her on the inside beginning to feel some excitement from the closeness of their bodies outside of combat as well. Give you a bit of extra time to get your hands on me, after I got you all excited yesterday when you returned, she smirked despite how bad her throat felt right now with his forearm shoved so hard against it, seeing the twitch of irritation over his eye. Then again, you're all over me as it is. Beerus schooled his expression at that remark, not giving his irritation at that reminder away, knowing full well she was just saying this to rile him up. Or at least he hoped so, anyway. You really need to get over yourself, Hera. Whatever the heck you have cooked up in your mind right now, I assure you, it has no basis in reality. He said, as he pulled back and let her go. A flash of disappointment crossing him inwardly at his actions, which he ignored just as readily as the thrill a moment prior, as she reached up and rubbed her neck a little. The damage he'd given it, like all other wounds, healing over quickly. So, you say, but I'm not the one who got aroused yesterday over some kissing and then stormed off the scene because you couldn't handle me exploiting this odd weakness you seem to have. She smirked back at him, some of that smugness returning even after the ass-kicking he'd just doled out, though at the same time, feeling a good bit of disappointment inwardly at him pulling away. All that power, and you're that flustered over some affection, makes me wonder what you were doing out there away from us all after I got back at you for before. She cheekily glanced down before glancing back up again, almost mocking him herself with how grating her knowing tone became. You were quite excited down there, after all. Only because this body of mine is stupid. Nothing more. Beerus shot down in a way that no doubt came across as both childish and nonsensical, but he didn't give a damn, because it was pretty much the truth, as far as he saw it. In any case, we're done here. You can go back to the others now. And word to the wise before you leave. Don't pull that shit again. Don't pull what? Hera asked facetiously, playing dumb as she stepped forward away from the mountain that steadily began to mend the damage done to it, as it did the ground and forest area as well to a slower extent. I have no idea what you mean, brother. Just get out of here, Beerus deadpanned after a sigh cut through him, feeling his patience slip once again, even after blowing off most of his aggravation on her already. Stick around any longer and you'll become an eyesore. HMPH. Crude as always, Hera shrugged. And in denial too, she added, as she passed him by. The rips and tears on her tunic mending themselves over in no time, just as her wounds had done. She then flashed him a pert smile, as she turned to look at him one last time, with a hand mounted to her wide hip. I'd offer to give you a kiss of gratitude like our sister Demeter did before, but I think we both know you'd get a little too excited from it, after your reaction to the last one I gave you. Are you done? Beerus held back his annoyance, crushing that stupid other sensation that rose up in his body and giving her nothing. If she wanted a rise out of him, she'd need to do better than that, and he damn well wasn't going to allow her the same opportunity from yesterday twice. She was getting firmly clapped the instant she gave him the feeling she'd try that crap again. Unless you want to stick around for round 3, which won't go any different from the last, just get your ass away from here and back to the others. Hera snorted somewhat derisively at his attitude, looking for a brief moment like she was considering staying for it, possibly just to try and rile him up more. In the end though, she seemed to think against it, and turned away. HMPH. No, I believe I've spent enough time alone with you for today, she said while offering a quick wave behind, her hips flourishing from side to side as she began to walk off with a bit of a more golden glow to her, heralding the use of teleportation. There's only so much of you I can handle, at the end of the day. And besides, wouldn't want the others thinking you and I have something going on outside of training, would we? She said in a tone just mischievous enough to make him think she just might make that happen, purely to annoy him further. It was petty, but then again, they both were in similar ways, so that didn't shock him. And then she was finally gone, dematerializing away back to the others, and Beerus just let out another sigh, glad that he didn't have to deal with her again for another bit. Most of the steam taken out of his sails, not that he'd sparred it out of himself, though his vexation with her still remained to an extent, and with how she was, he doubted that would ever really go away. Bit of a shame you ended it there, young one. If you were just a bit less stubborn and closed off, you could have returned the favor to her in full. The recognizable voice of Gia suddenly chimed in from behind him with a hint of disappointment in her tone. Beerus turned to her with an unamused look, as she had her arms crossed beneath her giant bosom, squishing and pushing up her perky mounds atop them, back to more his size as opposed to the Hecatonchias. Despite her tone, she was smiling at him, as she continued. In my opinion, you and her could end up having quite the passionate relationship. And I could say something similar for Demeter, as well, if you'd bother to give it a chance. Is there a reason you've come to see me, other than wasting my time hearing such drivel? Beerus shot back with a tone and expression far from amused, partially glaring at her. I've got my training to get back to, after all, and I'd much rather be doing that than listening to you tease and annoy me about such nonsense. Gia sighed, though looked wholly unsurprised by his attitude. She'd grown used to it whenever she brought this subject up, even if teasingly. My apologies, young one. I didn't come simply to tease you about that, even if you make it far too easy for me to do so. She winked at him, regretting nothing. The action giving him a reminder of Whis again, for all the wrong reasons. Out with it then. I'm sure your sons are missing your company already, he said, while passing a glance 20 miles into the distance, where he could see the trio of multi-headed and many-armed giants relaxing about. One literally laying over a mountain like it was some kind of recliner having a snooze, while the other two just sat around him, presumably having some idle chatter. There was a brief pause then between him and the primordial goddess, before Gia unfolded her arms from her jiggling breasts and came forward. Her smile becoming tender and warm, as she proceeded to pull the purple-haired deity into a firm hug, squashing her enormous pear-like thick pancakes against his front. Beerus's awkwardness kicked in immediately as his eyes darted to her with a befuddled look. Her voice being gentle and filled with warmth, as she spoke softly by his ear. I know this is a little belated, but, the real reason I came, was to thank you, young one, for rescuing my boys from that terrible place, and setting them free once more. It's fine, Beerus replied after a bit, not quite returning the hug, but not pulling away from it either. You made it a condition if I wanted your training, after all. I merely kept my word and did as you asked. Nothing more. There's no need for you to thank me for keeping my side of our deal. Even still, it's because of you that they walk free once more. You have no idea how long I've anguished over their imprisonment. As their mother, knowing that they'd spent more of their eternal lives locked up in that wretched pit than up here where they belonged, always filled me with grief and sorrow. She said earnestly, and Beerus could genuinely feel the emotion coming out from her voice, as she hugged him tighter. He could swear he even heard a low sob coming from her at the memory, as he felt a bit of wetness over his shoulder. Hold on. Was she crying? No, Beerus, the mother of all life corrected herself, using his name with emphasis. Even if you just saw this deed as your part of our agreement, even still, I just want you to know, that from the bottom of my heart as their mother, thank you, she whispered with more sincerity and gratitude than he'd probably ever heard in his life. Both this one, and his universe 7 days included. Raw emotion of joy pealing through her voice, as he felt more tears from her drizzle down over the back of his shoulder. Thank you for bringing my boys home. You will forever have my gratitude for that. You're welcome, I guess, he responded rather awkwardly, not really knowing what else to say, as she continued to hold him in a strong, and admittedly pleasant embrace. He found himself subconsciously patting her back as she shed yet more tears of happiness on top of what she had yesterday. Being thanked like this, even now, was not something he was used to. When she pulled back, her breasts puffing back out with a pertinent wobble into the normal shape. She held onto his shoulders as she met his eyes, allowing him to see the tears that had been flowing down her cheeks for some time now, along with the grateful smile she held. She then lifted herself onto her toes, as she leaned in and kissed him on the forehead. The sensation behind it not one like the unfamiliar ones that Hera and Demeter had given, but more of one filled with a kind appreciation that had him. Combined with this warm, calming aura she was releasing similar to Hestia, for once, he was not cringing at that kind of affectionate touch. I wish you the best of luck in accomplishing your goals, Beerus. I'll be there to support you and your siblings every step of the way. You can count on it. She told him with perhaps the most beaming, heartfelt smile he'd ever seen. After a small moment, Beerus couldn't help the small smile that crossed his features. As mushy as this was for his tastes, even he wasn't able to keep his typical aversion to this sort of thing here and now. Even if just for this moment, Gia seemed to have that effect on him, almost infectiously so. Hey, glad to hear it. Several days later. HNGH. Beerus let out a grunt, as he focused inward. His body radiated his dark purple aura, as he attempted to call upon his domain's power. The dummy gear had given him still intact and without a scratch since the day it had been made, as he raised his hand up and pointed it at the construct's face, barely 2 inches away, his palm facing it with his thumb crossing over the center in a way he was all too familiar doing for the Hakai. Yet unlike all the times he'd done it before in his old world, nothing came of it here, even though he could feel the concept of destruction itself embedded within his being. It refused to surface in any meaningful way, but Beerus did not let it get to him. Gia had already given him all that he needed, after all, by explaining to him how he should be going about it, so it was all on him until he reached that point. And it was for that reason that she didn't need to be with him as he did this now. Something that no doubt worked out well for her, as it meant more time spent with her sons. Then again, he wouldn't doubt she was probably still watching him from a distance out of the corner of her eye as well. As impatient as he could be, he was able to practice patience when he really needed to, and this was one of those times. So, no matter how many times he failed to yield a result, and harnessing his domain slipped through his fingers, he kept trying, knowing he'd have a breakthrough eventually. He must have tried doing this just today alone a good 1,000 times already, and gotten hardly anywhere. His progress was like a snail. Painfully slow. Almost to the point it would have driven a lesser being mad. He was a bit too experienced in all the millions of years he'd been around before his rebirth, however, to be affected by it anywhere near to that extent. For now, no matter how small and incremental it was at present, at the very least, he could feel himself steadily grabbing onto more of his domain bit by bit for his own use, treating it as it was now. One with him, and he with it. Even if he was only inching along now, he knew, as soon as he was able to bring some bit of his domain's power to the surface for use, it was game time, as things were sure to pick up from there. It's still not working for you yet, brother. His latest failed attempt was followed by Zeus's voice reaching him from his side, causing him to look over to his left at his approaching little brother. Beerus had been aware on some level that he'd been watching him for some time now at a distance, but had clearly only chosen now to speak up and approach him. Not yet. No. The elder of the two replied, as he brought his arm down for the minute. His expression calm, if a little displeased that he was being interrupted. Baby steps, I suppose. It's rather slow going for my tastes, certainly not something he was unused to, given the time he'd dedicated to trying, and failing, to master Ultra Instinct. I'll have it down eventually though. Something struck him then, and out of curiosity, he followed that up with a question of his own. Speaking of, have you achieved a domain for yourself yet? You've had your inner power mastered for some time now, so I'd expect you've at least put some thought into it. Ah. That's gone fine, actually. Just yesterday, I was able to intertwine my soul with my first domain. The silver-haired deity replied as he stopped about 2 meters away. A proud grin forming over his features at his own progress. I had two that were responding to me quite strongly, with one that felt much more encompassing than the other, but Metis convinced me to go for the smaller one first. Said it'd be easier for me to get a grip on compared to the other one, and that the experience with it would help me fly through the process with the bigger one when the time comes. I see. Beerus nodded. A bit intrigued that Zeus seemed to have a similar experience to what he'd had. The only difference was that the two domains he'd picked from had felt roughly on par, instead of one clearly being superior to the other. That's good to hear, I suppose. Mind telling me what you picked? Sure. Provided you tell me yours as well. Zeus shot back with an intrigued expression of his own, though that quickly morphed into a more questioning look, as he crossed his arms over his broad chest. We can chat about that later though. The reason I came over here is because I wanted to discuss our plans of recruitment with you. Recruitment? Yes. Zeus nodded. Me and Metis have been thinking lately, about how the Titans have no doubt rounded up all their support from the other gods. According to both Gear and Styx, there should be no shortage of those who will not take Kronos' side, either because they'd prefer to remain neutral, or they're dissatisfied with the way Kronos and his allies do things, such as Styx and her children. Go on. Beerus motioned him to continue, as he turned to him fully, showing a small amount of interest in what he was saying. Well, Styx said she and her children wouldn't be the last to come to us, but we have no idea how long it's going to take for those that share her opinion to come along on their own. That's why me and Metis have come to the conclusion that we should get the word out, and host an assembly to gather up those who have not agreed to join our opposition, so that we may gain the allegiance of as many other beings as possible in one go. And perhaps even convince some of those who'd rather remain neutral to join our side, if possible. The younger brother explained, whilst stroking his beard and looking his older brother over for any sign of disagreement. I came here to make sure you'd be okay with us doing this. After all, it can't hurt to know of those who'll have our backs in this conflict sooner, don't you agree? I suppose so. Beerus nodded, not being against the idea. I assume you plan to enlist Gear's assistance to get this invitation, seeing as she's the only one capable of getting it out to everyone in a short amount of time, to my knowledge. Already ahead of you on that. Zeus smirked. Metis already asked her about it earlier, and she said that she'd be more than willing to do so. As I said before, I just came up to make sure you were fine with it too, before anything happens. He said informatively, before shifting gears a bit as he continued. And while we're on this topic, might I ask if you'd heard back yet from any of the Cyclopes about our new residence they've been setting up? No. Not yet. The older brother shook his head in response. Beerus had been sure to let everyone know what Arges had told him some days back. It had been following on after his spar with Hera and moment with Gear, just as his siblings finished their training for the day, and passed on the information to everyone there. Suffice to say, there'd been some buzz around the idea, and pretty much everyone had gotten on board with it, given if what the Cyclops had told him was true. That's a bit of a shame. I know I'm probably being impatient right now, but based on what you were told being accurate, this new location atop Mount Olympus will be the perfect spot for us to do it. Us residing atop a mountain even greater in size than O3's will undoubtedly give off a strong impression to those that come, especially if you, the one who smashed his way out of Kronos' gut, is there to give a few words. Provided you don't mind doing that, of course. Zeus was sure to add diplomatically, not wanting to come across as though he was trying to pigeonhole his older sibling into doing something he might prefer not to do. If you'd prefer not to, that's okay too. I'll do the talking in your stead. No, that's quite all right. I can say a few words if needed. Beerus acquiesced, as he mounted his fists on his hips. Just don't expect me to beat around the bush and go off on some motivational speech for everyone. That sort of deal just isn't my kind of thing. Not unless his existence was being threatened like it had been during the Tournament of Power, of course. In which case, then he'd make an exception. Hee, fair enough. The younger deity chuckled. You can speak first then, and I'll handle the rest after you're done. Sound good? Zeus broached, jutting his hand out for his brother to take in agreement. Rolling his amber eyes a bit at the gesture, Beerus took the hand with his own and shook it a little. Yeah, sure. That's fine. Now if you'll excuse me, I'll be getting back to my training. I suggest you get back to yours too. Wouldn't want to be slacking off too much, after all. Unless you want the others to end up passing you by, of course. Please, what do you take me for? A lazy bum? The silver-haired fledgling god scoffed, though there was clear amusement in his tone, as he could tell his older brother was just messing with him, as their hands separated. If anything, you're the one who should be worried about me passing you out. He said with a playful laugh, one which Beerus snorted at amusedly. Come back to me when you're throwing 10 times more effort into this than I am, and I might just take that seriously. Until then, keep dreaming. The older brother shot back half serious, half playfully, as he gave a motion of his head to shoo his little brother away, before turning his attention back to the dummy. Seeing that his brother was done with the conversation, Zeus just shrugged. His bearded face still grinning as he turned away and began to glow with the telltale signs of impending dematerialization. Just before he did, however, a familiar, one-eyed being made his presence known by appearing in the area a few meters behind them both, catching their attention immediately as the 25-foot-tall being cast a shadow over them. Zeus's golden glow quickly flickering out as he and Beerus turned to the bulky figure of Arges, who looked down at both of them, the elder brother in particular with a strong, toothy smile, as he proudly put his hands on his hips. Sorry for the wait, Beerus, but everything's been set up now. Hope you and your folks aren't too busy at the moment, because I'd like to show ya all your new residents. A little while later. Welcome to your new base of operations, you lot. Arges announced with pride, as he and the 7 siblings, alongside Metis, Styx and her children, appeared with a flash in a very open area. The group having left behind their mother Rhea, Gia and her 100-handed sons, who'd chosen to stick back on Crete for the time being, and the goat nymph Amalthea who'd elected to take a nap inside Mount Lycaos, since this whole affair didn't concern her. Everyone's eyes were instantly met with a massive, glimmering palace made out of flawless white stone with carefully crafted, glistening bronze foundations right in front of them. The group standing around the bottom of a white staircase leading up to an open entryway with huge pillars jutting out on either side around the front, sides, and presumably the back to keep the roof steady. The total height of the structure stretching upwards to be far taller than even Arges, at well over 100 meters high, with the area it covered being easily in the tens of millions of square feet from what they could see, as the rest of it seemed to merge in with part of the mountain behind it. His siblings' eyes bugged out a bit at the sheer size of the palace in wonder, whilst Beerus was only mildly impressed. He'd lived in much bigger before in his own castle back in the now destroyed Universe 7, after all. Still, to his standards, when compared to other palaces he'd seen besides his own back in those days, mainly from the mortals he'd visited, it was definitely of an impressive and respectable size, for sure. Aside from the huge palace, around it seemed to be a vast, cloistered courtyard of sorts as he and the others glanced about. One that stretched on in all directions out from the structure, going out before them for tens of miles in almost all directions from where they were standing. At the edges of the courtyard, which was filled with stunning stone pathways, and luscious, grassy areas, it was closed off all around like a dome by thick, rocky walls from the mountain that were 2 to 3 few feet high. Mist shrouded above their enclosure on all sides, clearly by magic, to block out any would-be trespasser's view, but at the same time, must have allowed for its inhabitants to see through it, for once Beerus focused just a little bit, he found he could easily peer through it and see the outside. There appeared to be a physical entrance made for this place as well. Just opposite of them, at the far end, stood massive golden gates that were easily 20 meters tall and wide. Ones that shimmered with an ethereal glow of magic that allowed them to be easily seen in full detail, even as far away as they all were from them, adding quite the sense of grandeur to what was, to most of the assembled deities, already quite the marvel to look at. That's when Beerus noticed it. And this actually did get quite the amazed reaction out of him. It was the air here. Back in his past life, he'd inhaled the air of many a planet's atmosphere that he'd visited, ranging from pleasant, like Earth's for the most part, to downright disgusting like some of the more primitive planets he'd had the misfortune of bothering to visit. However, the gaseous substance that permeated all around where they currently stood, was pure. Pure in every sense of the word, to the point where every breath taken into his nostrils and mouth, or that grazed his skin, felt like its own form of breezy heaven that made any other air he'd felt and breathed before, even the best ones, feel like garbage fumes in comparison. Heck, even his own former residence in Universe 7 couldn't compare to this. You like what you see, folks? Arges asked with arms folded over his chest, seeing the impressed looks on everyone's faces. You are all currently standing near the summit of Mount Olympus, far beyond the clouds of the sky and into the deep recesses of the heavens, and nearly twice as high up as Mount Othries, at approximately 1 million kilometers above sea level. Wait, what did he just say? At that last statement, Beerus's eyes widened in shock at the stupidly high number they'd just been given. Sure, in the grand scheme of things, he'd crossed distances like that back in his old universe in a minuscule fraction of a second, but that wasn't the point. He had never, in all the planets he'd been to, heard of a mountain that could reach such extreme heights like that. He'd seen a few planets with that kind of height to them before, but never a single mountain being as such. He'd say the Cyclops would have been exaggerating, had it not been for the totally honest and matter-of-fact way in which he'd said it. You'll have to forgive my brother's absence. Brontes and Steropes are currently in the forge room we set up within the mountain, and are currently hard at work getting the material for those weapons I promised ready to go. The Cyclops remarked, explaining his fellow one-eyed sibling's lack of appearance. Once I've shown you around and explained things a bit more, I'll be joining 'em down there, in case any of you might wonder where I went. The others either nodded their heads, or gave some form of motion or murmur to show they acknowledged what he'd said. Beerus being the only one who didn't. Not that anyone took note or offense to that, however. Now then, we'll start with this here palace first, which we built directly in Beerus's honor, he said while motioning up to the structure, casually dropping how they'd built it specifically for Beerus himself. This is where you all will be staying for the time being, he said as he began ascending the steps, with everyone pretty much following on behind him. Once they actually entered the building proper, they were all greeted with a golden floored central hall that must have taken up a solid chunk of the inside, because it was expansive to say the least. It held a wide and spacious table at its center, crafted from the finest materials this world likely had to offer for such things, that looked like it could handle thousands being seated at it if needs be, as though it was made for grand feasts, though currently only 7 throne-like, golden chairs surrounded it. A paltry number given the width of the table, but was clearly there to signify a spot for just Beerus and his siblings at said table. That table and those chairs can shift in size if you want them to. So, if you don't like how it's set up, you can freely change it without issue. Arjais explained upon noticing the befuddled expressions he was getting from quite a few of the 7 children of Rhea. This seemed to be readily accepted by everyone, so he just moved on. As they walked by, they all saw how on the opposite end of the room from where they'd come in, there was a vast, open window that showed the outside. One that gave them all a clear and mesmerizing view through the mist of the bright blue sky, and the fluffy field of white clouds below them being illuminated and lit up majestically by the sun's rays. They were then taken through the rest of the ginormous structure, going through the various bedrooms, storage rooms, and so forth that made up what was mainly meant to be Beerus's abode. The layout of the full place was honestly pretty basic and nothing too over the top despite its sheer size, but it was clear everything in and out of it was made with the greatest of care, and most sublime of skill. Beerus especially appreciated what he'd seen of the beds, particularly the one designated within his own master bedroom that they passed through, which even just from a glance he could tell had a perfectly soft mattress and pillows to go with a flawlessly silky quilt. He'd be a big, fat liar if he said he wasn't looking forward to taking a well-deserved nap inside of there at some point. That was for damn sure. As they were going through these, the one-eyed giant took the time to explain the security of the mountain. Mainly about how they'd set up a magical barrier all around the summit, to go along with the added protection their mother had already given over to the mountain. The barrier apparently making the place where they were completely inaccessible to those who they did not want getting it, by effectively turning the inside into its own sub-dimension, if he understood it right. The kind that one couldn't simply crack their way into through brute force, even if in their true divine form, according to Arjais. One had to have permission from them in order to get inside, apparently, whether they were coming in through the gates, or just teleporting in. This meant that even though Hyperion would be able to see them if he got close enough, he wouldn't actually be able to do anything, provided what Arjais said was accurate. Something which at this point, Beerus didn't have much reason to doubt. These Cyclopes sure were showing their usefulness, all right. After a while, they'd all eventually come full circle back to where they'd started within the Grand Hall, and Arjais could only grin as he stretched his arms out on either side, as if to emphasize what he was about to say. It's quite spacious, isn't it? I'd like to think we did a decent job with the place. He then glanced down at the former cat deity in particular. What say you, Beerus? You like what you've seen? Beerus gave a small nod of acceptance, liking the place overall. This seemed to be good enough for the Cyclops to hear, as he nodded back with a pleased smile at his simple response. Good to hear. Oh, and as for the other 6 of you, he said as he folded his arms again while glancing down at Beerus's siblings. We haven't forgotten about you fine folks either. We're conscious of the fact it'd probably be insulting to just have one palace dedicated to Beerus and ignore the rest of you, so once this whole war with Kronos and his allies is over, we'll be sure to build you all one each as well. Do we all get one as big as this? Poseidon piped up questioningly as he glanced between the Cyclops and the structure, unashamed to admit he'd feel envious if theirs ended up being smaller than their brothers, and he wasn't the only one thinking that either, after hearing what the Cyclops had just said. Ask the boss over there. Arges replied, inclining his head toward Beerus, who had now been officially designated the boss, apparently. We wouldn't mind doing that, but given he was the one who got us out, it's up to him, whether or not you do. Simple as that. Beerus would have to admit that he found it rather amusing when Poseidon immediately turned to him with a pleading look over that, almost like he was some child trying to convince his elder to give him that snack or toy that he wanted. It kind of reminded him of Champa in a way, if he was being honest, which made a part of the purple-haired god want to say no to him out of principle just to mess with him. Like he did in the good old days with his fat-ass twin brother. Doubly so when he saw Hera giving him a look that said, "You better not," when she saw him mulling it over, and likely gathered that he was considering saying no. In the end though, Beerus just shrugged and showed his indifference. Provided they were all getting the same quality, and there was no disparity on his end, he genuinely didn't give a crap, really. Sure, go ahead and give it to them. Makes no difference to me. He then jutted a thumb out in the eldest Oceanide's direction. Might as well add Styx on that list as well, seeing as she aided me in getting to you. That won't actually be necessary, but I appreciate the gesture all the same. Styx declined readily with a wave of her hand, while giving an appreciative smile over to Beerus for the gesture. Once this war is over, I'll be returning to my river, where I'm most at home. A palace up here would be wasted on me, seeing as I'd never use it. HMPH. Fine then. As you wish. Beerus replied back with another shrug, feeling as though he was going to owe her quite a bit by the time this whole thing with Kronos and his merry band of morons was over. He was sure he'd have something figured out by then to pay her back for her services, though. Alrighty then. With that settled, guess my job here is over for now. The black-haired Cyclops stated with a casual shrug of his own. I'll be in the forge room with my brothers if you need me. Gotta get to work on those items I promised you, after all. He finished, pulling one arm away to give a wave goodbye, before he vanished from sight into golden flecks. So, what now?
Okay.
Hades asked curiously, speaking for almost everyone there, as he took the time to let his gaze sweep around their new surroundings once again. What now? Beerus parroted, as he brought everyone's attention on him. His gaze briefly locking with Zeus's in particular, who nodded back at him. Both knowing the answer to be obvious. Now, we do what we've been doing. We prepare, in every way we can. The Olympian god of destruction. Chapter 17, the Titanomic EX. Atop Mount Olympus, 2 days later. Near the summit of the biggest mountain Beerus had ever come across, the area that he and his family would now reside in was loaded up with visitors. Hundreds, no, thousands upon thousands of deities, both of minor standing and major standing from what the purple-haired god could surmise, had all arrived here. Some of them, according to Iapetus, having come on behalf of bigger groups, of which a few outnumbered the amount of beings here quite easily. Gaia had clearly done what was asked of her, for sure. Beerus wasn't entirely certain as to how she'd curated them to make sure none were spies for Kronos ilk, but it wasn't like it really mattered. Even if some of them were, with how this place was set up, the little info they could give over wouldn't really help Kronos or any of his allies get to them. There were definitely a few of them that stood out more from the pack, enough to where Iapetus had been quick to let them all know about them. The first was one of Gaia's Titan daughters sired by her and Uranos, the former ruler of the universe apparently before that piece of shit father of theirs. Her name was Themis, and she stood right by the front of the crowd of assembled deities at close to 6 feet in height with her lithe arms folded beneath her ample D-cup bosom that jutted out through her conservative white tunic that fell to about her feet, and covered most of her upper arms. Her body, even through her clothing, was sublimely curvaceous with a slim waist and wide hips that did well to show off an hourglass figure concealed beneath. She had dark, silky smooth hair done up in a bun with a few strands crossing over the middle of her high forehead just a smidge smaller than Hera's and arcing over to the sides of her head and around her ears. Just below that were her wide-set eyes that were a brilliant, captivating shade of lilac that were both calm and focused, similar to how a judge or lawmaker would be. Her full, red lips were set into a neutral expression that gave nothing away on her flawless features, with skin that was paler than any of his brothers or sisters with the exception of Hades. Between them was her small, cute button nose, and below was her small chin that both rivaled Hera's own, with a jaw just as narrow and short as Demeter's, and high, sharp cheekbones that were on par with Hestia's. In other words, yet another goddess whose beauty was near indescribable and put any mortal woman's from any other universe to shame. His first thoughts upon seeing her gaze had been correct as well, for she was apparently the Titan goddess of divine law and order, domains of hers that had incidentally not been being used to their fullest under Kronos' reign. And by that, he meant barely at all, given the Titan Lord saw himself as the one who should be making the rules, and no one else, effectively giving her the metaphorical finger. Knowing that, it honestly wasn't hard to figure out why she may have come here and abandoned Othries. And considering the immense power he could feel radiating from her, he could see even more why Iapetus was pleased to have her here. The next deity couldn't have been more of a departure in terms of appearance. His brownish hair was wild and unkempt, reaching down by his shoulders with equally as wild-looking facial features that, while not ugly, one couldn't exactly call ruggedly handsome either, with greenish-brown eyes that seemed equal parts protective, as they were untamed and lustful, with the way he glanced about at some of the nymphs near him. He held the hindquarters, legs and horns of a goat, in the same manner as a fawn, instantly bringing up a comparison for Beerus to that goat nymph that they'd lived with on Crete, which if he remembered right, was called Amalthea. The half-animal-looking god had the hands of his beefy arms mounted on his hips, just below his hairy barrel chest and by his shredded abs, as he stood a ways away from Themis close to the front, completely bare, with his genitals dangling out for all to see without a damn to be given. Poseidon had joked that was probably because he was proud of being hung like a horse. If you were to ask Iapetus though, it was more to do with him, as well as the trio of satyrs, beings that held the same kind of half-goat appearance that flanked him, being too much one with their own natural domain to give a damn about wearing anything. Sort of like gear, in a sense. And it wasn't like they were the only ones going nude either, as there were quite a few nymphs that had come naked as well. The wild-looking god's name was Pan, and his main domain was, go figure, the wilds. He had more than that, but that one was the most noteworthy. Beerus could sense he was powerful, but not as much so as Themis was, at least as they were now with their true divine forms. Iapetus had simply given a wry smile when he'd pointed that out, and said that if Pan did decide to join their side, he would make quite the defensive asset, as his screech was unmatched when it came to warding off those that he didn't want encroaching on his space. That including even the strongest of Kronos' allies, and perhaps even Kronos himself, which was quite the thing to hear. Made him almost tempted to hear this screech out for himself just to see how effective it really was. Getting away from him though, the next deity, or rather two, to get singled out were sons of Iapetus. The names were Prometheus and Epimetheus, and stood side by side relatively close to Iapetus around the front as well with their muscular arms crossed over their chests, and were both about the same height as Beerus or Zeus was in their no doubt downsized state. Both wore brown tunics that reached near their ankles, with the former having dark brown hair and the latter a dirty blonde that was long enough to fall past their shoulders, and in terms of build, they both sported well-muscled physiques that were only a tad less impressive than Beerus or his brother's own. Their faces were near identical, with rugged and well-defined features and a strong jawline. The two distinctions between the two were that Prometheus had a curly, dark brown beard that fell to about his chest with gold eyes a shade brighter than Beerus's, whilst Epimetheus had a shorter, blondish beard that was closer to a stubble around his chin and jaw, with eyes a much darker amber that held hues of green, hazel and brown. Prometheus was potentially the best of all to see among the assembled deities, as being that he was the god of forethought, he was capable of peering into the future itself to at least some extent, which meant he no doubt had a strong idea of what would happen in the coming war. So, for him to be here, it spoke volumes of their chances at victory in the long run. Well, either that or he was here to warn them against going to war, but just given the air around him, neither Beerus or Iapetus could see that being the case. Styx and her spawn had opted to stay inside the palace for this, whilst Beerus and his siblings alongside Iapetus stood at the top of the stairway leading up to said palace of his, and for the time being, the rest of his siblings as well. All whilst the guests were grouped up by the bottom around the courtyard area, with most seeming to be chatting a bit amongst themselves. Beerus could hear them all quite clearly as they did, with most having to do with why they were up here, which was to be expected. Others spoke up concerns about the safety of this meeting location, and the possibility of Kronos already knowing where they were, or of Hyperion finding them and attacking, neither of which was an issue, but the former god of Universe 7 could tell they just hadn't been told about this location's security yet. That would be rectified soon enough by either Zeus or himself, should his little brother gloss over those details. And then there was the select few that had nothing to do with any of that, which he ended up tuning out almost immediately, given they were gossiping about pointless crap he couldn't care less about. Like who they fancied more or who they wouldn't mind laying, or consorting, with if given the chance, among any of the assembled cast here, including he and his siblings. Seriously, select few or not, was this really the time to be discussing that kind of crap? In any case though, it didn't last much longer, as Zeus decided this was the perfect time to quell the chatter, and get on to brass tacks, as he cleared his throat. The sound loud enough to get those closer to shut their traps, and like a domino effect, The rest followed suit until there was nothing but silence. His little brother's expression was dead serious, similar to how he got during their spars when he was at his most focused, as he surveyed the crowd, making sure he had everyone's attention. And once he was sure he did, and that no one else was still talking, did he motion for him to begin, essentially giving him center stage. All right, the purple-haired god began, stepping forward in front of everyone with his fists touching behind his back. His voice loud enough to carry through the entire area clearly and have everyone's rapt attention. I'm not one for mincing words, so I'll just cut straight to the point. Welcome, all of you, to Mount Olympus. For those of you wondering who I am, my name is Beerus. And in case that name doesn't ring a bell, I'm also the one who punched his way out of that oaf Kronos' gut and the one who declared war on him, and whoever is foolish enough to take his side. More like promised to destroy him and humiliate his peons, but it might as well have been the same thing. You are all here before me and my family, for one of three reasons. It's either because you're undecided on what you want to do, you're neutral as of now, but want to see what we're all about regardless, or you have already decided you don't like our bastard father's regime, and would rather throw your lot in with us. Allow us. So long as you don't get in my way or become an ally to Kronos, there's no issue. When this war is over, you will receive no punishment. Should you choose to stay out of this conflict. I can promise you that. As he paused for a brief moment, he got some grateful murmurs from some in the crowd, who looked more than pleased to hear he wouldn't come after them if they did stay out of this. Though this was mainly because in his mind, they weren't really needed. It was nice to have more allies so that they could stop the fodder from getting in his way, sure, but he wouldn't go so far as to call them a necessity, at least to him. Because if they had been, he'd definitely be singing a completely different tune right now. Metis and Zeus would no doubt disagree with him on that, but it just was what it was. At the same time though, as Zeus had been expected, many were in some form of awe, not only from where he and his family now lived, but him as well. He'd noticed it the instant he'd stated the action he'd taken to escape that rancid pit. Most of their eyes had come alight with an added sense of admiration. Probably because many of them could only have ever thought about rebelling against his rule up until he'd come around, and in their eyes, probably done something they thought no one would have the balls to do. Challenging the Titan King's rule. And not in any feeble way either, but about as emphatic as you could get, as if to let the whole world know that Kronos' days ruling the universe were numbered. If any of you have questions, get them out of the way now if you want me to answer. Otherwise, you'll be directing them to Zeus instead. Beerus remarked whilst bringing a fist up and jutting a thumb over his shoulder in said younger god's direction. There was a very brief pause in the air after he'd said that. Before Beerus could start thinking that no one had any, which would be all good for him, someone decided to pipe up. HMPH. Guess I'll bite then. A gruff-sounding voice reached Beerus's ears, causing him to turn his gaze over to the origin of it. That being the half-animal-looking god who'd spoken. The half-goat deity boring right into him from below with his narrowed, greenish-brown eyes, which had lost that lustful side they'd shown before in favor of a much more serious expression. One that oddly held a hint of anger to it. If we join your side, do we get anything for it in return? Oh. You're asking if there'll be a reward for you for joining us, him. Beerus narrowed his eyes right back at the god of the wilds, totally unmoved by his unwavering stare. I suppose Kronos and his merry band of buffoons getting ousted from power isn't enough for you then. No, it isn't. Because for all I know, you could end up being just as much a tyrant as he is, and swapping one prick out for another isn't exactly something I would call a proper reward for my services. Pan sniped back, totally unafraid of how such a statement could be taken, as he crossed his arms over his chest, while throwing out an even fiercer stare at Beerus. Others here may be willing to join up with you just for taking down Kronos, but I'm not one of them. I'll need more convincing than that. If you want my support, I want you to promise me something. Well, if there's one thing the ex-destroyer of the seventh universe could give this guy, it's that he certainly had a pair if he was willing to ask for a deal like this. Beerus decided it best to humor him for now, and see what it was that he wanted, rather than simply shut him down without hearing him out. And that would be, whenever possible, do what you can to avoid destroying any wildlife in the future. Pan replied swiftly, with the protectiveness of his glare having shot up a good notch or two, as his dropped down into a scowl. The wilds are bound to me, so I can feel everything that goes on in said domain. That includes the presence of others, and you were definitely going through the wilds at high speed on the day Hyperion obliterated those forests. The day I felt all that wildlife, which I am the protector of, vanish into thin air, and all because you led him through the wilds. He growled, clenching his fists so hard that he nearly drew blood, and the three satyrs behind him didn't look all that better than he was. Those animals and dryads, they're all dead now, wiped from existence, partially because of you. Within the palace, unseen by those outside, Styx, who'd been keeping an ear out to listen in on what happened outside, visibly cringed from hearing that, knowing that the fate of those capable of death in this world simply ceased to be once it happened. And of all those that could be the most upset about something like, it would undoubtedly be Pan. If there was one thing she knew she had to do at some point, it was apologize to him for that slight upon his domain, as even though it couldn't really have been avoided, there was no changing the fact that she and Beerus were partially responsible for the loss of so much wildlife regardless, due to leading Hyperion through such areas. Meanwhile, back outside, Pan continued. If I'm to toss away neutrality and join forces with you, I want your word that you'll ensure no added harm comes to the wilds from your rebellion. Should you choose not to, I'll take my leave here and now. The trio of satyrs nodded at his words, confirming they'd do the same and stand with their apparent leader. Having destroyed many a planet and civilization in his previous days, Beerus did not cringe at the confirmation that death for beings capable of it here meant disappearing entirely. Nor did he at the fact that he and Styx had a small part to play due to having Hyperion chase them through the wilds. His expression was totally neutral, as he never broke eye contact with the half-animal god. Inwardly though, he could understand why someone like Pan would be angry about that, even if he personally didn't care, given this was something he had such a strong connection to. In any case though, he could see there was one small issue with what he was trying to get him to agree to. And what about when we are battling Kronos and his ilk? Do you expect him to care about that too and avoid throwing attacks at the wilds should I be in close to them? No. I don't. Pan answered back without hesitation, knowing damn well alone from how Hyperion had blasted apart those forests under his domain several days ago without a second thought that neither he, nor the other titans would give a damn. A fact that only further pissed him off on the inside. They won't care about the amount of damage they do to anything around them, provided they win and their rule is solidified in the end. You though. I would hope you and your siblings at least give some bit of care, enough to try and avoid my domain getting caught in the crossfire when you can. Otherwise, outside of your desire to take them down, what separates you from Kronos and his strongest allies? That got a few murmurs of agreement from the crowd, and while they were but a small amount, there was no denying that just about every assembled deity, minor and major, were awaiting his response. Which meant he couldn't be lazy and just cop out by throwing that question over to Zeus. Speaking of Zeus, he and the rest of his siblings, as well as Metis, were watching to see how he replied. Best I can promise you is I'll try. Beerus shrugged. Can't really give you anything else, since I can't see the future. Hell, even he'd regained his ability to have prophetic dreams, that wouldn't have really given him much to work with in terms of the finer details. And as for your other question, well, I can also say with absolute certainty, that if I ever had children of my own, I wouldn't go and devour them like our so-called father did to us over some dumb prophecy. Beerus sneered at the memory of the bastard having the gall to eat him mere moments after his second birth, before smirking as he continued. I don't even care if said prophecy foretold that one of my children would end me. If anything, something like that would only excite me. It would. Zeus thought to himself in surprise at that, as did just about everyone else, including even the rest of their siblings. If he were in that situation, he doubted he'd do something as repulsive as what Kronos did, but he damn sure wouldn't be excited about such a prophecy. Nor did he think anyone else here would be, for that matter. You'd be excited about that? Pan blinked, looking rather stunned himself at Beerus's admission, as he stared at him somewhat incredulously. Not quite believing his ears. Are you serious right now, or are you messing with me? Oh, I'm dead serious. If such a prophecy were to come my way, then I'd know that a proper challenge would be awaiting me in the future. Beerus explained with a genuine smirk. Far from try to get rid of any, in that situation I'd do everything I could to ensure that whichever or however many children that prophecy referred to grew up to their full potential. In that way, I could have someone that would push me to be better at what I do. I'd have to be mad to run away from an opportunity like that. Because he knew better than anyone, once you were at the top with no real peers, things got pretty damn boring after a while. That's why he'd been so elated at the potential of the vision he'd seen of the Super Saiyan God being true in the first place. Granted, he didn't plan on siring any snot-nosed brats, but you never knew what the future would bring. He had no interest now, but if a prophecy of a truly powerful god to be born from him doing so became a thing, he'd be more than willing to play ball and stomach any annoyances that came from it, provided whichever kid, or even better, kids it was could reach a point to push him to his limits. Push you to be better, huh? Pan muttered, ruminating on what he'd just been told for a small moment. He'd met a fair few bullshitters in his time, so he'd like to think he was decent when it came to telling when someone was lying to him. Because right now, he couldn't sense even a slither of deceit in what Beerus had said. Only complete honesty. This guy would really take such a prophecy-ed child wishing to take him down, just as he plans to now for his father, as a way of challenging himself to improve as a ruler. Pan smirked himself then, somewhat misinterpreting what Beerus had actually been getting at with that, as he looked upon him a good deal more positively now. I sure hope you mean that, Beerus. Of course, I do. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't mean it. Beerus scoffed at the mere notion that he wouldn't, not realizing that he'd given Pan, and by extension, pretty much everyone in attendance right now, a bit of a wrong impression on the real meaning of his words. Now then, back on topic. I've given you my answer, so, if it's not enough for you, then feel free to leave. I certainly won't stop you, he said while motioning his hand to the side, making it clear just with the way he looked at him that he meant it. Hey. I think I'll stay, actually. The half-goat god replied with a grin. You've convinced me enough to at least give you a chance. My allegiance will rest with you for now. HMPH. Well, all right then. Beerus gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his eyes glancing around the rest of the gathered deities, getting the sense that whatever he'd said there seemed to have warmed the crowd up to him quite a good deal. He wasn't entirely sure why, but he wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth, so he'd just roll with it. Anyone else have something to ask before I hand the reins over to Zeus? Or will that be all? Yeah. I have something to request if you don't mind. Another male voice, one that was much less gruff than Pan's, piped up. Another one. Beerus sighed, his gaze shifting over to the one who'd spoke, who happened to be none other than the god Metis was most pleased to see joining them today. The second-generation Titan Prometheus, who appeared to have a friendly, if somewhat mischievous smile on his face, as he gave the reborn god a small wave. What is it? Prometheus's eyes shined at him. Oh, don't worry, it's nothing too big. I was just hoping that when I joined you, you'd allow me to work on a project I've been wanting to do for some time. Perhaps even allow me some help me with it, if I need it. He hoped. Wasn't this guy supposed to be able to see the future? Shouldn't he already know the answer to that? In any case, Beerus rose a somewhat confused brow at him, as he answered him. Well, provided it won't impede me in any way, I don't see why not. Letting curiosity get the better of him, he then asked, what's it about? I can speak with you about it later, if you're interested. The son of Iapetus broached earnestly, with his brother giving him a grin, clearly knowing about what he was talking about, as Prometheus began massaging his beard with a sharp eye. I'd rather not hold up this assembly any longer than I have, after all. Especially with something I'm sure no one else here cares about. Beerus wasn't certain why, but there was just something about Prometheus's project request, and that odd glow to his eyes as he spoke of it that was drawing out his more inquisitive side. Like whatever he was planning, would be something rather interesting, at the very least. Sure. I'm fine with that. He nodded in agreement, seeming to satisfy the second-generation Titan with his reply. Anyone else? Beerus glanced around one more time, waiting to see if anyone had anything else to ask him personally. When he saw that there was none, he almost breathed a sigh of satisfaction that his little part in this get-together was over, and turned his back to the crowd, stepping back toward his siblings and tapping Zeus on the shoulder. You're up. Was all he said, exchanging a look with his little brother, before taking a spot beside his favorite sibling Hestia, as Zeus nodded in thanks and stepped forward to greet everyone himself. As he did, Hestia turned to Beerus with her hands held by her front and below the waist as she gave him a wide, warm smile, and glowing eyes holding a hint of pride and admiration. The fledgling goddess murmuring softly enough that only he, as well their siblings and Metis, could hear her. You really are something else, brother. Never ceasing to amaze. That's one way to put it, Hera said lowly, still in a bit of disbelief over what he'd said to Pan in particular, as she briefly looked over at him with a bit of incredulity. Then again, that could be said for Poseidon, Metis and Zeus himself too, to varying degrees. A part of her would admit to being impressed by the sheer guts he had to state what he had and mean it, but even still, she found what he'd said to be bordering on lunacy. Allowing and even aiding someone who was fated to become powerful enough to overthrow you in getting that strong just so you could push yourself to get better was pretty much on the complete opposite end of absurdity that Kronos had taken against them, as far as she saw it. On the upside though, whatever future children he had with his spouse wouldn't be in any sort of danger of getting as woefully mistreated as they had been no matter what. Because if even a prophecy of that magnitude couldn't do anything other than make him want to rear them up even more, then it was safe to say that for however crude he was, or perhaps out of his mind, he may well make a good, or at least proper father. And that, for a good few reasons, pleased her to know. Demeter was somewhat stunned as well, though her disbelief had been quickly quashed when she remembered how much he'd helped her up to this point, as well as the rest of them, leaving her with a strong smile. He could be harsh, like he was during spars, but even that was just to better them because he cared, so it wasn't hard for her to buy that he may well do something like that in the future, when he took their father's position as ruler of the universe. That, and she was of a similar mind to Hera when it came to what he'd said about any of his own future children and such a prophecy, and was pleased knowing he would most likely be a decent father for multiple reasons. Hey, I can definitely see what he said to Pan being something our brother would do, all right. Hades commented amusedly, as he grinned at his brother with his arms crossed over his chest, having shook off the initial surprise of what he'd said to the god of the wilds after having thought about it. Instead, having it replaced in favor of the kind of respect and appreciation they all knew he held for their eldest brother. As though he expected nothing less of him than to come out with a claim like that about a damning prophecy being leveled on him involving one of his own children coming after him. As far as he was concerned, thinking back on how he'd challenged the Titans the way that he had, alongside everything else he'd done up to now, what he'd said to Pan wasn't that much removed from what he'd done already in his mind. Of course, it is. As I told him, I wouldn't have bothered saying it if I didn't mean it. Beerus once again shrugged. He'd spoken lies before in the past, both in this life, and many in his previous, but that was only when he had a reason for doing so. Lying about himself there would have been pointless. He also didn't see what they were so surprised or proud about, given he didn't think he'd said anything to really warrant such, but was willing to take the compliments for what they were anyway, and just leave it all be. Honored guests of Olympus, like my elder brother before me, I would like to start by welcoming you all here, on these hallowed grounds within the heavens. The attention of Beerus and his fellow siblings, as well as Metis, were drawn to Zeus as he started, his deep voice practically booming throughout the area. The youngest of them taking a page out of his eldest brother's playbook, as he brought his fists behind his back and touched them together as he stepped forward to address the amassed audience. As was just uttered by Beerus earlier, my name is Zeus, and it is a pleasure to see so many of you come here, and no doubt some of you in plenty others' stead. For those of you in attendance, I shall let you know now in case it has not been mentioned to you yet, but you needn't concern yourselves with the potential of our enemies finding and attacking us while you're here. Kronos' all-seeing gaze is limited to that which is beneath Othries, and seeing as we ascend higher, he will not be capable of spotting us here. And as for Hyperion, Zeus' eyes narrowed forward, ahead of the group and beyond the courtyard, as though he was staring through the sky right at the aforementioned Titan. He who patrols the skies for his master in hopes of finding us, whilst he may have luck with that, it means naught for us, for he cannot get past the barrier that has been set up around the mountain's peak. There was a visible form of relief that seemed to come over those gathered that had been worried about those things, and every one of them was quick to relax a bit more with that knowledge in mind. More so than they'd already been after Beerus had spoken. Said God was more than happy with the fact that none of them had wasted his time asking him such questions about it, when it should have been obvious if they were willing to put this whole thing together without caring about Hyperion or Kronos showing up for a visit. Regardless, Zeus had been quick to nip that in the bud, so it didn't really matter anyway. If there are any of you joining us now, or are still undecided, who are nervous about what may happen if we are being watched, then don't be. Once you join us, you are free to remain on Olympus with us until this war is over for your own added protection and security. You have my word on that. The silver-haired deity continued earnestly, his voice carrying over confidently and with the ease of a highly charismatic leader who'd done speeches like this thousands of times over, despite this being the first proper time he'd done this. In addition, I feel it is important to add on to what my eldest brother said earlier in regards to your status, should you choose to join us or not. While those who choose not to will certainly not have their position put in jeopardy, those who do join us, and show an exemplary effort in our eyes with their aid, will absolutely be honored for it. Zeus surveyed the crowd once again with his eyes in less than a picosecond, catching all of the intrigued reactions he was getting. He knew Beerus wouldn't get annoyed by something like this, due to what he'd said with Pan, and with Prometheus to a lesser extent, so this floodgate was already open, and he'd be damned if he didn't take advantage of it. Not only to boost morale and willingness to fight harder for those that were joining their side, but also increase incentive for those who hadn't yet. As you all saw to some extent with both Pan and Prometheus, pledged to fight well by our side, and we have no issue granting you something in return, outside of the defeat and dethronement of Kronos, should you wish it. Provided of course it's not something silly like us making one of you the new ruler of the universe. That honor will only be bestowed on either Beerus, myself, or one of our two other brothers, and no one else. Well, technically, since Beerus was the eldest, it was effectively his to claim by birthright, but in case his brother had no interest in taking it, or he could convince him not to take the position, then it was essentially down to him and his other two brothers. Regardless, he might as well let all that be known in case someone here actually was stupid enough to suggest they be the new ruler over himself, Beerus, Hades and Poseidon. His latest words got some good reactions from those in attendance, and while it was clear for him to tell that most had no interest in such other than Kronos' fall, those who'd been on the fence still had perked their ears up at that, which was what he'd been looking for. None more so than Themis, however, who seemed to have a very pleased smile on her face with that knowledge being given. If she wasn't already going to join them before, she sure as heck was now. Metis was also smiling behind him, proud to see her consort using and adding on to what Beerus had thrown out to full effect, garnering much more interest from the more neutral parties as a result. She hadn't been expected to say anything of note, but she was glad he'd bothered to in the way he had, as it was making things easier for Zeus to sway everyone to their side. Becoming the new ruler of the universe, huh? Beerus's brows knitted together as he pondered that particular bit in the background, zoning out from whatever else Zeus was saying as the younger of the two went on with his speech. He'd sort of let that little tidbit fall to the wayside up to now. Not really thinking about it at all in favor of the more pressing matter of destroying Kronos, but once the Titan King had been felled by him, that would open up his position as the ruler of the universe. And it was obvious that someone would have to take over when that happened. The question was, did he actually want that position himself? On the one hand, a part of him thought that wouldn't be the best idea. He'd like to stroke his own ego and say he'd do a fine job, no problem, but that would have no basis in reality thus far, given his previous track record. The last time he'd been in a position of authority over a universe, he'd done such a piss-poor job that he'd had the second lowest mortal level around. Heck, he wouldn't even be here at all had he done an actually good job with his previous universe, that was an undeniable fact. In the end, he'd had to be saved by Goku from erasure at the last minute per the Grand Priest's own words. If he took the position as king, there was a decent chance he'd just fall right back into old habits, and make a mess of things due to a lack of good governance. On the other hand, the thought of anyone here being able to boss him around when this war was over didn't sit well with him one bit. It didn't matter if it was one of his brothers, or even his sisters being the ruler, he didn't think he'd be able to stomach someone weaker than him having a position of authority over him in the grand hierarchy. Not even if it was Hestia, who he favored the most. He'd only begrudgingly put up with Zeno and by extension the Grand Priest having full authority over him because both filled him with fear, the former more so than the latter, and could both annihilate him even at his strongest with but a casual flick of their pinky finger. Here though, the only beings that might end up being more powerful than him when he'd achieved his true divine form, and that would be without any additional training on his end to grow stronger, were Gia and the god he'd sensed down in the pit. And even if they would still be more powerful than him by that point, it was pretty obvious neither cared or would be going for such a position themselves, as otherwise, they would have attempted to gain it already. He couldn't help but remember the Grand Priest's final words to him again, about how he should try to do better in this life than he had in his old one. That left the small dilemma of which was the better choice. Did he swallow his pride and allow someone else to take the position, which would put him beneath someone else's authority, or did he take the position for himself and just roll with it? If he went for the latter, as much as he'd love to say he could handle it all on his own, he knew that wasn't true. He'd need some help, particularly with setting up some proper order and laws to be followed, seeing as he'd only really had to enforce divine laws in his past that had already been made, and had sucked at even doing that for the most part. If he wanted to at least attempt to be better in that scenario, he'd have to task someone more suited with that responsibility to come up with them, and then do a better job on his end of ensuring they were enforced, instead of just doing what he'd grown accustomed to. Slacking off and sleeping his way through the many years he should have been active, and then when he was awake, ignoring what he was actually supposed to be doing in favor of doing his own thing. That last part would be tough if he decided to take the position, seeing as he'd kinda been thinking about taking a nice long nap after he took out Kronos. Sort of as his own way of celebrating that oaf's obliteration, right after a fine feast of course, which would involve all the delicacies this world had to offer, which he'd yet to taste. I can't decide right now. I'd best leave deciding on this for later at some point. Possibly once everything with Kronos is set and done. By then at least, I should definitely have a better idea of what option I'd prefer to go with, as both have their pros and cons. Beerus thought to himself while massaging his chin. Admittedly, purely due to his own pride, he was leaning more towards saying screw it and becoming king, but he couldn't deny that choosing to allow someone else to take that mantle would allow him the perfect excuse to be far more laid back and lazy in the time to come, with much less responsibility. Even if it did lend itself to him technically being under someone else's thumb at the same time, who would be inferior to him power-wise, which really rubbed him the wrong way. And also, depending on how he went with it, could also end up with him blatantly ignoring the advice he'd been given by the Grand Priest eventually, and possibly make him slink back into his old habits harder than ever. Again, he'd have to think on this some more later. Right now, it was best to focus more on his training and other important things related to his current goal. He'd cross that other bridge when he got to it. So, are you with us? When Beerus finally snapped back to reality after a bit, it was to Zeus shouting out this question with that booming voice he'd given himself, and the crowd in front of him hollering enthusiastically, almost as one, that they would be. Good. Beerus, myself, and the rest of our family are pleased to have you all on our side. His little brother boomed back with confidence. Then before Beerus's gaze, almost like a hype man before a battle, pumped his fist into the air with a kind of zeal that made it clear he was feeding off of the crowd's energy. To the defeat of Kronos. To the defeat of Kronos. Everyone but a select few in the crowd cheered back, somewhat raising their own fists into the air as well to mimic him, like they were toasting to their future victory and the change that would come of it. Those that didn't simply grinned, feeling the strong amount of enthusiasm in the pure air on Olympus, as even the neutrals had been swayed to joining their side by this point. Beerus, though he didn't really care all that much for the added assistance, couldn't help but give his younger brother some props, as did the rest of their siblings from what he could see, if their somewhat impressed looks were anything to go by. Though he'd no doubt missed a good chunk of what Zeus had spouted, there was no denying based on the excitement from just about everyone in the assembled group below them, that if nothing else, Zeus had a talent for getting a crowd pumped up. Later. Once things had somewhat calmed down, the vast majority of those who'd assembled, like Pan and his little group, had taken their leave of Mount Olympus, believing that they wouldn't need to stay up here with them during this war. Either that or they didn't want to leave their own current residence behind, seeing as it wasn't quite compromised yet, so they took their chances going back there. The rest, which numbered around 200 to 300, had chosen to stay and make this mountain their new place of residence at least until the war was over. Either from fear that if they didn't, they'd be found out by Kronos' allies and physically, viciously reprimanded for taking their side, or because they preferred to stay there with them atop what would become the new place of power within the universe once the war was finally over. Putting confidence in their side to come out victorious, as they should. No one from Beerus's family minded, and he didn't really care either, since they were taking up home around the courtyard for the most part. The only ones who didn't were those that were the more powerful of the remaining lot, who would now be staying in one of the various extra bedrooms inside his palace with them for the time being, or perhaps even permanently given the sheer amount of free room his abode held. Those being that of the Titaness Themis, who'd thanked them for their hospitality and had gotten into some form of conversation with Metis and Styx not long after coming in. The others were the second-generation Titan brothers Prometheus and Epimetheus. Both of which had given a nod of thanks to Beerus and the rest for allowing them stay in the palace, as they politely moved off to their rooms. Prometheus having been sure to motion towards the former god of the seventh universe, asking him if he wanted to chat about his little project then and there. Still curious, Beerus had been about to agree and see what he would be cooking up, until he felt the presence of Arges appear behind him. His appearance garnering some small surprise from Prometheus and Themis, though it clearly had nothing to do with them having not known he was free, which meant Zeus had likely mentioned his freeing of them when he wasn't listening. That, or in Prometheus's case, had possibly already known about it beforehand. He had no idea what the limitations were for the Titan's future sight, but it was a possibility. Perhaps he should endeavor to ask him about that later. In any case, Arges had taken up his attention almost immediately, and after briefly apologizing for his interruption, had smiled down at him with a prideful gleam in his singular eye. "They're ready, Beerus. We've finished them," was all he'd said, and those few simple words alone had been enough to fully grasp Beerus's interest away from anything else. And that was what had led him to the present moment, where they all stood in wait in somewhat of a semicircle, as the trio of Cyclopes in what must have been record time, had completed the items. All three having appeared in front of Beerus, his family, and the guests within the palace for this special occasion, with 4 embroidered, glimmering bronze containers being set out before them all. We only had enough material for 4 of them, Arges was quick to say, explaining how there was only enough to account for about half of the children of the Titan King and Queen. The material used to make weapons like this is hard to come by, even in the infinite vastness of the universe, so for those of you left out for now, don't fret. Once we get our hands on more, we'll be sure to build you your own symbols of power if you want. Beerus's siblings all nodded at that, as that sounded fair enough. So, who were the other 3 items made for, then? Poseidon was the one to ask from the lot. Everyone knew Beerus was the obvious choice for one, but there was 3 more here that were unaccounted for. That is of course to say, if you made them with any one of us particularly in mind. Yep. Brontes nodded, pointing to the one that had been set by his feet. This one's for you, in fact, Poseidon. And before you ask how we decided this, Arges interjected, seeing the second youngest brother getting excited at this news, while others seemed to be curious on why they'd made them with someone already in mind. Let's just say, me and my brothers have a unique little ability that allows us to read folks better than most, and from that, we were able to discern what would be the best fit for you, and who would be best to focus on first. Purely on the viability of how useful these 4 symbols of power would be in the war that is to come. So, does that mean those that weren't picked would have symbols of power that are not as suited for combat? Hera asked inquisitively with a raised brow, as she folded her arms beneath her ample bosom. Right you are, dear Hera. That is correct. Steropes replied affirmatively with a polite bob of his head. You're one of them in fact, as are your sisters, dear Demeter and Hestia. That actually took Beerus by surprise. Hera, who'd been possibly the most aggressive out of all his siblings, and was about as stubborn as he was, had been read off as going to have something best suited to a far less combative role. He almost couldn't believe he'd heard that right. Hera looked almost as surprised as he was by that little fact, as were a few others. That being said though, she seemed to just take that news for what it was, showing only a small bit of annoyance as she nodded back at them. Probably because she was aware trying to argue that with them would have been pointless and futile. Neither Demeter nor Hestia seemed to really care about being left out for their own reasons, so that meant there was no real fuss over this. This one right here is yours, Beerus. Arges remarked, motioning to the container he'd set to the left of his feet, before then motioning to the one he'd set on the right of them. And this one would be yours, Zeus. Which just leaves you, Hades. Steropes added, motioning towards the one at his own feet with a proud smile of his own at what he and his brothers had crafted. Hope you 4 enjoy what we've made for you. I'd say these are our best work. Alright then, let's see what you've done. Beerus walked forward, and his brothers weren't far behind. Before long, each stood in front of the container that was laid out on its back and stretched out to roughly their height, with a bit more width than their own bodies. The purple-haired deity was the first to grab his lid, which clicked audibly as it came off the container and was slid down to the side. Once Beerus saw what was laid out inside, comfortably resting within a cushiony red center, he almost couldn't believe what he was looking at as a small chuckle left his lips. Seriously? Am I being pranked or something? Of all the things it could have been, it had to look exactly like that. Reaching inside, his hand rested on, and then wrapped around the brownish handle of a 4-foot-long sword and pulled it out sideways. Exposed to the light, it glinted ominously and beatifically with Beerus's face reflected over the spotless, sharp, wide blade. There was a thin, golden cross-section cutting off the handle and the blade, with a dark purple, oval-shaped jewel of some description lodged in the center, and below his hand, it had a greenish-blue pommel to tip it off. The reason for his chuckle, you might ask. Simple. Outside of the jewel, he was basically staring right at a near-exact replica of the Zed sword that he'd sealed the Elder Kai inside eons ago back in his old, now erased universe. Sure, it looked better made and more refined, but the resemblance to that blade was truly uncanny. What made it even funnier, was that outside of the time he'd bonked Elder Kai on the head with it for annoying him, before then sealing him inside of it, he had little experience with using a sword. He was more of a hand-to-hand guy, after all, and that was what all his combat training had centered around. Just then, he felt it pulse against him, and heard a sound only audible to him, which almost sounded like the purr of an animal that recognized him as its master. A dark purple aura identical to that of his own then coated over the sword in the next instant, and with it came this sudden rush of intense sensations throughout his entire being, that felt as though it was harmonizing with his more destructive nature. It was soothing, and in a way, despite having not held a blade in a long time, made him feel just as comfortable with it in hand than he felt when bare-handed, as though it was quite literally an extension of himself. Of his will. The divine nature of the blade was unmistakable, and he got the sense that no matter how powerful he became, the sword would always be able to handle his strength no matter what, and that was only the tip of the iceberg. Hey, well, I can see you've taken to it quite nicely. Arges said amusedly while looking down at Beerus, crossing his arms over his chest and glancing over with further amusement as the other three brothers held similar reactions to their symbols being held by them. As have they, it seems. Though that's to be expected, I'd say. Snapping out of what seemed like a trance, Beerus' eyes followed where the Cyclops' gaze went once he got over the initial rush that his new weapon brought on, and saw what was being held in each of his brothers' hands in turn. With Zeus, it was a literal thunderbolt that as of now, stood about 3 to 4 feet in length, and appeared like a zigzag above and below Zeus's clenched fist surrounding the middle of what was definitely more than just pure electricity, as its form crackled with blue electricity that felt both natural and divine simultaneously, and held a shimmer of aura to it that matched Zeus's own. Past him, Poseidon's symbol of power was a glimmering, golden trident that had 3 razor-sharp tips for its blades that looked poised to pierce through just about anything. The trident easily being the longest of the items, standing just as tall as Poseidon himself and pulsating with a majestic sea-green aura that matched Poseidon's, who seemed truly mesmerized by what he was holding, as though he'd recovered a part of himself that had been missing all this time. Like with Beerus and Zeus's own, it felt completely divine in every aspect, and resonated with Poseidon like it was but a part of him, both physically and spiritually. Finally, there was Hades, whose item didn't seem like a weapon in appearance at all. In both hands, held near his chest was a stunningly well-crafted, blemish-less bronze helm that secreted an aura identical to Hades' own. It too felt divine in every way, but also held this added sense of, well, otherness to it that Beerus couldn't quite put his finger on. His sword probably felt the closest to the helm, as it emitted a significantly more ominous and dark sensation around it in an almost black miasma that one could only see when staring directly at it for long enough. As though it had been made in the deepest, darkest pit of an all-consuming abyss. Those certainly have quite the feel to them, Demeter muttered in some form of awe with her hands clasped anxiously by her chest. The fledgling goddess unable to stop the small bit of fear that inched up inside her whenever she gazed at Hades for some reason. For whatever reason to her, there was just something that felt really off about it. And it seemed as though Hera, and even Hestia to a lesser degree shared her sentiments. You three have most definitely outdone yourselves here. I can practically feel the immense power radiating off of them. It will be most interesting to see what those four symbols of power can do on the battlefield. Themis spoke up from her spot by Styx with a highly impressed tone. Her voice coming across as both elegant and refined despite the clear shade of awe held in her words. Thanks for the compliment, sister. Feels good to see you again with this big old eye of mine after so long. Arges gave a motion of his head akin to tipping a hat at her praise, before refocusing his attention on the four brothers. In any case, hope you four get plenty of use out of them. And just so you know, they don't just look and feel the part for you all. They each have their own unique abilities to them that I'm sure you'll all enjoy having at your disposal. A face-splitting grin came over all three Cyclops features once the eldest one-eyed giant had said this, making it clear they were eager to see their creations in action. And for some reason, he had a feeling that they wouldn't have to wait long to see it. Meanwhile, outside of the barrier protecting Mount Olympus. This magic, there's no mistaking it. This has to be where they're hiding. Hyperion remarked as he stood to his full height with a burning gaze, his eyes glowing with divine power and heavenly light as he kept his chariot halted in the air, about 50 meters or so from the barrier enclosing around the summit. One he could tell just by the make had gears and the Cyclops' fingerprints all over it. The latter of which he was surprised to be feeling, but that quickly gave way to even more anger, as he realized who must have busted him out to accomplish such a strong magical barrier being put up. One that likely not even his true divine form could brute force its way through. I can feel not only Mother's power, but the stench of our younger, one-eyed brothers on it as well. I can only imagine how our brother Kronos would be reacting to this news. As if they're out, then it's a guarantee that the Hecatonchirs are free as well. Thea said coolly, sitting back regally in her place on the chariot with one lithe, curvy leg crossed over another. Admittedly though, there was a hint of unease at the thought of the gargantuan hundred-handed ones being set loose once again, as they'd no doubt have a bone to pick with their little brother for what he did to them. Do you want me to notify Kronos now of this location? No. As I told you before, I don't need help to take that son of a bitch down. Hyperion stated coldly with fire in his eyes, as his heavenly aura radiated out of his body, brightening up the sky around them like a second sun next to that of his own son Helios further away in the heavens. I'm going to take that uppity little brat down by myself, and then drag him and the rest of his siblings back to Othries for Kronos to finish off. I see. So, I assume you've got an idea of how to get around this barrier then? She looked to him with a small, but knowing smile. I have an idea of how I might, but given the make of this barrier, it could take me a little while to accomplish it. Possibly a few days or so. That small wait is of no bother to me though, so long as I get through and get my hands on the cocky little shit who made a mockery of me. He scowled deeply, his glowing eyes reflecting a level of malice that at this point surpassed even that of which he'd had for his bastard father Uranos. The last time we met, he had me foolishly following along how he wanted me to, and led me and you along like complete idiots. Not this time though. When I find a way in, he won't be so fortunate on this occasion. I'll waste no time laying siege to this place myself, and show that arrogant nephew of mine just how powerful I really am. A cruel smirk then made its way unto his lips as he imagined the kind of pain he'd inflict upon Beerus, and on Styx as well if she was brave enough to linger around whilst he got his payback. And will I be coming with you, or would you prefer me to stay out here? You'll remain out here on the unlikely event that things go awry. I'll give you a signal if they somehow manage to gain the upper hand on me and trap me in there, so you can retreat back to Othries and inform Kronos of everything. Understood. Thea nodded resolutely, not doubting her brother-husband's words for an instant. He wanted a backup plan in case of failure, no matter how small that chance may be. Given she could tell he was planning to use his true divine form as soon as he got in there, or perhaps even beforehand. Be sure to give that arrogant fledgling an extra hard thrashing for me, okay? HMPH. Don't you worry. Hyperion chuckled cruelly. I'll be sure to show him just how much of a mistake he made when he decided to declare war on us.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you want some more What If video. Comment 3 hearts for more What If.